at Northwestern University, and I'm also one of our staff couples therapists. And a large part of my practice is working with people going through kind of difficult and challenging transitions to parenthood, and working with a lot of couples who are kind of struggling to balance both full-time careers as well as family time. And so I thought maybe it would be helpful for us to talk a little bit today about some of the unique challenges that dual income couples have. And I thought I would start with kind of going through changes that have kind of happened in the past couple decades to American families. I think one of the biggest, most significant changes has been that in the 70s, about 84 to 90% of kids lived in a household with a married couple. Now, a lot of that isn't defined as whether or not that was both their biological parents or if that was blended family situations. But today, in 2016, only about 65% of kids lived with a married couple in the house. On top of that, we've seen a rise in single moms. So in the 70s, it was about 15% of kids lived with a single mom, and today about a quarter of kids do. We've seen a rise in single dads. But on top of that, one of the most significant shifts in American households has been that both parents have started working outside of the home. And so what used to look like a single parent providing the majority of income for households has now shifted to where, and the graphics aren't showing up super fantastic. Sorry about that, guys. I'm not the best with PowerPoint. We've seen a significant rise, the top line in the graphic to the left, in both parents providing income to the household, as well as that middle line of male-only providers. So we've seen this major shift in where it used to be about 30% of houses in the 70s had dual income coming in, and now it's almost 50 to 60% of households, whether it's co-breadwinning, where one parent earns about a quarter to half of the household income, to actually co-breadwinning, significant breadwinning, which would be 50% or more. So why does this all matter? Like, why are we talking about this? I think one of the biggest things is Pew Research and some other research organizations have found that almost 60% of women report having difficulty balancing both work and home life. And about 14% of them report it being extremely difficult. And so with more and more people in this configuration, what can we do to help couples kind of navigate it a little better? So I thought we would kind of talk through a little bit about the history of marriage in America. So we have two really incredible social psychologists out there researching this, one of which is our own Eli Finkel at Northwestern University. So how did we go from this kind of quote unquote golden age of marriage where dad went out and earned the income and mom stayed home and cooked the dinner and served the family and took care of all the kids? So Stephanie Coots and Eli Finkel said that American marriage has gone through kind of three evolutions to get from this kind of mom serving dad meals to this balancing act where both parents are working, trying to manage kids and their careers. So the first kind of iteration of marriage in America was kind of a pragmatic one, as Eli Finkel said. He kind of described this as people were getting married for economic and kind of survival needs. Like, we were mostly an agrarian culture, so both members of the household were trying to help provide for the kids, for themselves, kind of a lot of times as uniting farms. It wasn't really necessarily about love or partnership in the sense of like personal fulfillment. The second wave in marriages is what Eli Finkel describes as love-based. And so this kind of came about at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. We went from marriages being about kind of providing for the household to marriages being about a partnership and falling in love with someone. This kind of happened at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, where people started moving off of farms and into urban areas. A lot of younger people had economic freedom and choices outside of their parents for the first time in history. And so we saw this wave of people making choices around marriage that were based on who they wanted to be with versus who they needed to be with. Along with that came the first wave of feminism. So in the 1920s, women kind of pushed for more political and economic power. And that's also where we started to see some segregation around the sexes and the jobs that they did. And so this is where we saw that rise of like dad going out and being the breadwinner, mom staying home. This didn't mean that all women stayed at home. It just meant that a lot of times what women were doing outside of the home when they were married was often the same thing they would do if they were in their own home. They were taking care of the children, they were cooking for other families, and that sort of nature. So that love-based wave of marriage lasted from about 1865 to 1965, and then we shifted into what Eli Finkel just recently in his book, The All or Nothing Marriage, describes as the self-expression marriage. So this transition happened about the same time as the second wave of feminism, when we saw a lot more women pushing for equality and pushing into the workforce, and Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. We also saw a really critical, what I think is one of the most important economic shifts and education shifts. We saw women starting to go to college. And we know that throughout history, the more education you have, the more economic power you tend to have. So in 1970, about 11% of women in the workforce had a bachelor's degree. And in today's terms, it's about 40% of women. Women earn 57% of bachelor degrees, 60% of master's degrees, and 51% of doctoral degrees. In 2016, 1 in 3 lawyers was a woman. In 1970, it was 1 in 10. So we've seen this huge surge of women entering the workforce, which has led to dual income households. It also led to a lot more economic independence for women, which a lot of various sociologists and historians think led to that rise in the divorce rate from 1965 to 1980. Women were able to choose to get out of bad marriages for the first time in history. And so all of this has kind of led from 1965 to now, what Eli Finkel has described as a self-expression marriage. Marriage has become more than just love. It's about fulfillment and a partner who can help us actualize our best self. But that also put a lot of weight on marriages. Our partners have now become our best friends, our perfect lovers. They're supposed to give us professional guidance. They're supposed to be our playmate. They're supposed to be our co-parents. And for some marriages, that makes it much more enriching and fulfilling. But for other marriages, it's creating a lot of burden. And throughout the talk, I'm going to be describing kind of marriage, but I also want to be encompassing and recognize that we've also seen a rise in couples cohabitating together and raising families, as well as we now have legalization of same-sex marriage in most states. And I really want to recognize I'm talking in kind of heteronormative ways, but this kind of applies to a lot of dual income couples. So I think within all of this, in the self-expression marriage, we see some unique challenges with dual income households. And I think a large part of that is we've also had a shift in parenting. And a lot of parents feel an intense amount of guilt, especially a lot of the women I work with, from being away from their kids all day and kind of ending up tasking out parenting duties. So it's almost like partners feel like two ships in the night, like one person takes one child, the other person takes the other kid. Another thing that I see a lot of couples coming in and trying to really wrestle with is what they're perceiving as quality time with their kids. We've come to a place where quality time for a lot of people is defined as like doing really special things with their kids, versus a lot of the research shows that kids view quality time as parents being in a device-free moment, like not having your phone, not being in front of your computer, and are being included in daily rituals. So a lot of kids would report quality time as going to Target with you, or just spending time with you cleaning the house and other things that I think a lot of parents feel like isn't actually quality time with their kids. So I think one of the other major unique challenges around kids in dual income households is childcare choices. This can create a lot of stress on couples because most of the choices available in the States are either really costly to have someone that's there around the time frame that you need help, versus having daycare that can be more cost effective, but can be really limiting time-wise and career-wise. And I skipped over a couple of my slides, so I'm going to go through them real quick on the education pieces. I'm, like I said before, really bad with PowerPoint. So I think part of what adds to the complexity about childcare is we're in this era where we're really trying to optimize our kids. And so a lot of times we're looking for the daycare, the nanny that can help us facilitate that. And one of the major challenges with childcare, if you are going the route of daycare, is that parents have to be there at a certain time to pick up and drop off the kids. And so a lot of couples have challenges negotiating who's going to get there first, who's going to be the one to leave work early. And sometimes with commutes and living in major urban areas, it can be really time constraining. The other major constraint around daycare, childcare situations in school is that if the kids are sick, they can't go. And so a lot of families have found that they run into this challenge of what happens when the kids are sick. 47% of women report that they're the ones taking care of the sick kids. So that means they're the ones stepping out of work or using their PTO time to take care of sick kids versus being able to advance their careers. And a lot of what can help couples in these situations, especially if you guys both travel as well, is trying to find a backup resource. And I'll admit that this is one of my greatest challenges as a working mom. And I recently found that a lot of towns, especially major urban areas, are starting to have backup childcare that will come to your house when your kids are sick and not able to go to daycare. It's normally a fee for service and a little bit higher of a rate, but it's one of the options that I think a lot of dual income parents should spend a little time exploring and talking through. What happens when the kids are sick? Who's going to take care of them? A lot of other ways to manage it is to divide up the week. You know, if the kids are sick Monday and Tuesday, dad takes off work. Thursday and Friday, mom takes off work, and alternating Wednesdays. So really kind of thinking through a plan of what happens when your childcare can't work the way you guys had intended. Another major shift in parenting is what I language, and I'm borrowing this language from a fantastic child developmental psychologist who wrote a book called The Gardener and Carpenter. She writes that we're in this era of parenting where we kind of are in this place where we think we can optimize our kids. And I think for a lot of us who are highly educated and highly driven, there's this desire for our kids to be highly educated and highly driven like us in a way that we almost are in the parenting community kind of giving off this message that we can build the perfect kid. If we follow all the right instructions, send them to the right classes, put them in a musical class, put them in a play-based class, put them in a second language, we can build the perfect kid who's going to excel at everything he or she does, versus looking at parenting as gardening, where we can select where we plant the seeds and how often we water. Is it getting enough sun? Are we nurturing it correctly? And giving our kids more competency versus focusing on excellency. And why I'm bringing this up in a talk about couples is because I think when we spend a lot of time trying to build the perfect child, we stop looking at our partners and ourselves, and we really hyper-focus on our kids. And this then creates what I would call an upside-down hierarchy in family, where the kids become the most important part of the family and kind of running the family, versus the two parents together creating the executive team to guide the family. In upside-down hierarchies, we send this really complex mixed message to our kids where everything is built around their time and their activities, especially on our non-work time, like the weekends or the evenings. And so we send this message of like, you're the one who's most important here versus ourselves or our partnership. On top of that, though, we're also in this place with parenting where we're so afraid of our kids failing or not excelling that we also insulate them from all these opportunities where they make decisions for themselves, like who they play with, how they do their homework, when they do their homework. And we're creating this kind of double-edged sword of saying, like, you're the most important person here and everything revolves around you, but I don't trust you to actually make decisions for yourself, which sets kids up into a really hard position when they enter young adulthood because they don't know what they can do for themselves versus what they can depend on mom and dad for. And it also creates an additional burden for parents where we're extending parenting into young adulthood, which can then strain our partnerships. And so part of what I'm advocating for is if we can free up our kids to go back to being more kids, we also free up ourselves to have more time for each other. And that's challenging when other parents aren't doing it, but looking at ways where you can allow your kids to be bored or self-direct or find activities on their own. There's a lot of research showing that this leads to leadership and resilience with kids, but it also opens up space that maybe if the kids can find something to do for themselves on Saturday afternoon, you and your partner can find some time for each other. One of the other major complex challenges that happens in all couples households, but I think is particularly hard on dual income households, is the division of labor and what a lot of people language as the second shift. So who comes home and runs the household, and who's managing what's called the mental load. And within the mental load, and I think there's this brilliant French cartoon that went viral at the tail end of last year, where it starts off with the question of the husband asking the wife, why didn't you ask for help? And it goes through this whole series about how if she had asked the husband to go do the laundry, it goes through all the other things that she did when she went down to get the laundry. She saw a bathroom that needed to be cleaned. She saw other things that needed to be done around the house. She remembered a doctor's appointment that she needed to book for the kid. She had all these series of things that were attached to doing the laundry. And she goes on to say that had she just delegated the laundry to her husband, the only thing that would have gotten done was the laundry. The other thing that the cartoon addressed that I think is a really important thing for couples to talk through is that it implicitly gives power to mom in the sense that she's the household manager and dad's an underling. And I think this translates down to the kids because we frequently, and you'll probably find out there in a lot of the mommy blogs and stuff around dads babysitting their kids versus dads co-parenting their kids. And I think this is another part of this message that I don't think women intend to send and that I don't think men want to reinforce, but that mom's in charge of everything having to do with the household and that dad's just there as kind of like backup. And what the French cartoon goes on to really kind of highlight as well is that a lot of this is built in from when we were little kids. Like we give girls dolls and they play house and they have cleaning supplies. But we really don't invite boys to do those kind of things. So we're also socialized into these roles from a really young age and recognizing that we have been socialized into that, but that our culture and economy has kind of shifted and the way we're configuring our marriages and partnerships has shifted. And so a lot of what I talk about with my couples is the transition into parenthood is one of our biggest identity shifts, and it's a really major one. It also has a tendency to pull people back to traditional gender norms and roles that they saw their own parents act in. And we haven't come that far that we have seen so many different women do this. We've only got one or two generations that are out in front of us that have really given us examples of how to do it. And we're still kind of continuing to define what it looks like as more and more of us become female breadwinners. And I think it's really important both for husband and wives to step back and ask themselves, what kind of family did I grow up in? What kind of expectations do I have of how my parents ran their households, both bad and good? How do I want to run my household? How do I want to parent? How do we want to do this together? Do we have any mentor couples we can look to who are doing this well, who we kind of feel like are handling their family in a way we want to be doing more? I also talk with a lot of my couples that they sometimes accidentally slide into old gender roles. And a lot of that has to do with the first couple of years of parenting. There is a little bit more burden on mom, especially if she's breastfeeding. There are just certain tasks that can't get delegated to dad, but inviting dad in to do the tasks where he is able to do. I think another important piece of this is talking about each person's own expectations of how the household should be run, kind of what level of care and effort they want to put in. Because another very common complaint that I hear from couples, especially heterosexual couples, so I don't want to be gender normative here, but I'm going to be a little bit, is that a lot of times women say, I want him to help more around the house. And then the husband says, well, I try to help more, and then you end up telling me I'm doing it wrong, or you redo it. So a lot of what I talk about with couples is how can you help manage the expectations? And if you're going to delegate something to your partner, really try to make sure it's something that you don't feel so passionate about that if he does it his way or she does it her way, you aren't going to feel like it's not done right or that you have to redo it. And I think this is really important because it's also a time constraint on you if you're having to go back and redo it. So an example I often give couples is I grew up with a mother who's very particular about how the bathroom was supposed to be cleaned. And to this day, I still can't even delegate it out to a cleaning person because I'm very particular around the ways that she did it, that I have to do it too. So that's an example of something I shouldn't be delegating to my partner because I am never going to feel like that person's going to live up to the standard that I have for doing it. However, there are probably tasks around my house that I am fully comfortable letting go and just letting them have ownership with. This is also really important with kids because I think early on, after kids kind of enter the picture, a lot of that weight of mom doing a lot of the work then sets the tone that mom decides how things are done with the kids, and really inviting your partner and husband into areas and ways that they think things should be done. There is some research to show that kids connect a little bit more when dad's reading books to them than when mom is, because dads tend to animate the story or spend more time in the story. And so really looking at ways where, even if your partner's doing it differently than you do with the kids, recognizing that his way doesn't make it wrong or that something bad is going to happen with the children, really allowing him to have that authority in that area as well. Some of the other things I like to talk about with dual income couples is how to go back to reprioritizing that partnership. So how to really put that hierarchy back up to the two of you as an executive team. And I think one of the really big ways is to really talk through your expectations of each other's careers and where each of you are standing within your own career and how you can each help each other navigate that, as well as how each of you are kind of expecting or wanting the level of your family life to look, and walking through kind of what needs to be divided up and what can then be reabsorbed in each of your own roles, but also what can be outsourced. And outsourcing could look like the childcare you bring in, whether it's daycare or a nanny. It could look like bringing in a cleaning person, a lawn person. It could look like outsourcing some of the meal parts. I know a lot of families have now really tried to be conscientious about making meals at home, but if that's feeling too burdensome, do you need to look at the meal services like Blue Plate or Plated or Blue Apron, and really kind of talking through ways that each of you feel like is congruent with how you want the household to work, but doesn't make either one of you feel totally overwhelmed. I think another thing that I recommend to a lot of couples that helps them free up some space for each other and potentially even themselves is create a weekly logistics meeting. And even if you have a shared calendar or some of the really great to-do taskless apps that you can get now that you both can share it and see what needs to be done, having a touch point where you're actually verbally communicating it and going over the kid schedule, each of your individual schedules, who's coming in from your outsourced help, frees up the time and the anxiety that if you're worried about who's taking one of your kids to school and you guys haven't had an explicit conversation, you haven't looked at your calendar, you kind of then spend, if you get home from Monday late at work, you end up talking about the kids or the logistics. And so by having a weekly time that's dedicated to talking about all those things, it frees up those kind of accidental or unintentional moments of time that you guys might have together to actually focus on each other and have a moment where you get to turn towards each other versus trying to figure out household logistics. It makes it so that it doesn't feel like you're just in a partnership to manage your kids and manage a house and go to your each of your individual careers. It also opens up space for ways to integrate kind of what I call like little moments of togetherness. One of the things that a lot of power couples talk about is that they prioritize their time together, even sometimes over their time with their children. And I would argue that if you're happy with your partner and you feel connected to your partner, that translates in kind of, it's almost like trickle-down economics in a family, trickles down to your kids' experience of the family. If they're feeling you more connected, it's going to be a better atmosphere for even them. And so I often tell clients, because a lot of couples come in and say, we keep trying to put a date night in. Well, date night takes a lot. It takes extra resources with childcare. It takes extra time. It may take a lot more energy than either one of you feel like you have after a long week of work. I encourage couples to try to pick something to do together that they can do either almost nightly, a handful of times a week, that can happen in the house so you don't necessarily have to outsource more childcare and more time away. That could look like, a lot of times I recommend clients picking a television show that neither one of them has watched before and really actually making it device-free time that they can focus on the show and each other. and really then take a couple minutes afterwards. It can be as short as a half-hour sitcom, or if you guys have more time to invest, it could be, a longer series or a movie. It often frees up, and why a lot of my clients like TV shows is that it's continuous, and so it can become either a daily or a weekly ritual in which they carve out time to be focused together. The other thing I encourage is to dedicate some device-free zones in your house for both yourselves as a couple, as well as potentially for your whole family. That could look like dinner time being a device-free zone. It could look like the cars being a device-free zone. It could look like the bedroom being a device-free zone for a lot of couples. It kind of helps set the precedence that some of the time you're going to prioritize each other versus just work or just the kids. And I think this is really helpful because a lot of parents that have to leave work early to get to daycare to pick up the kids, then get back online after the kids go to bed. And so the feedback loop is continuously work, kids, work, kids, work, kids, and partners can feel very abandoned in that, and or you start to really drift apart. So the two periods in a marriage that we know have the highest risk for divorce are when kids are introduced at the front end and when kids leave and launch on the back end. And so really making sure that those two periods that you're working and anticipating it, but also talking through what is it going to look like from the time we have our children until the time our kids are gone and we have more time for each other. How do we prioritize making time for ourselves? And that looks different for a lot of couples, but really sitting down and being intentional about how you want that time to look. I think one of the bigger things too is to really recognize that a lot of what's happening with dual income families is kind of a larger cultural shift within our country. And so we haven't actually caught up in all of our gender norms. I think when I sit with couples and we really unpack the identity meaning of being a parent and now being in this partnership of raising kids, a lot of moms and dad go back to these really old gender norms of like dad being a provider and mom being the nurturer, and helping make space that both of you can be both at the same time, that dads really can be nurturing and a full-time parent, and moms really can be the provider as well as having space to be nurturing. I think another key point to point out too is that we still as a culture and a kind of more societal level haven't really put into place things that help support parents either. Only about 13% of American companies provide paid family leave, and that would include maternity, paternity leave, but that also includes, elder care or partner care. And I think a large part of what I sit with a lot of my dual income couples is that a lot of us Gen Xers, our parents were a little older when they had us, and we were a lot older when we had our kids. And so we're stuck taking care of not only our children at the same time that we're trying to help our parents navigate older old age and or some end of life issues. And those combined forces, especially if we're leaning into these old gender norms that women take care of all the family and they're quote unquote the king keepers, can leave a lot of women feeling totally maxed out and exhausted. And I think some of the bigger shifts around this have led us to be in positions where there's a lot of research showing that when men are financially dependent on women, they're more likely to step outside of their marriage and have affairs. But it also is on the opposite end of the spectrum. When men significantly out-earn their female partners, they're also more likely to step outside of their marriage. And so really challenging each other to think through what you're kind of carrying in about being a man or a woman in a relationship and as parents can be really helpful. I think it's one of those moments where it's recognizing that for women being in the workforce looks different for men. Anne-Marie Slattery is a professor at Princeton. She worked for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for a period of time under the Obama administration. And one of my favorite parts about her book, Unfinished Business, Women, Men, I have a typo, Work and Family, is she said, knowing your presence might help a child, parent, or spouse thrive, that you're stuck in a meeting or working another late night. Doesn't feel like choosing to sacrifice family time, which is often how men used to report feeling when they were at work and they had a stay-at-home wife. Something you wish you could have done, but are denying yourself for the sake of your career. It feels like you're sacrificing your loved one's well-being for your own aspirations. I think is a really it's a quote that resonates with a lot of my female clients, and being really mindful of that for a lot of times for women, it feels more like we're choosing to not be available to our family versus this is just a period of time that we're sacrificing family time. I think another really interesting thing that I found when I was looking through some images is the image on the left is an ad from the 1950s where it's this role reversal where mom's at work and she looks exacerbated at the desk, and dad's at home with the kids and clearly looking exasperated as well. Versus the image on the right is from a recent Newsweek where it says man up, and it's talking about how men should engage more at home and really questioning how we define masculinity and men nurturing as more and more men really want to be actively engaged in parenting. I think millennial men report the highest levels of desire to be actively participating. And so kind of making space for that and really talking through that with your partner for your own marriage. And lastly, I think one of the biggest things that I talk about with my clients on an individual level, but I think we could also be talking about on a larger level, is that in order for women to continue to have equality and to continue to professionally thrive, Ruth Bader Ginsburg so eloquently said, women will only have true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. And I think I see it so often on individual family level, and I think more and more we are starting to move to this, like how do we balance those two things? Because I think not only do women want to have professional fulfillment, I think men also really want to be more engaged at home as well. And so I'll leave you guys with some of my favorite resources and books and open it up to questions if anyone has questions or thoughts.
Yes. What suggestions do you have for women in global roles wanting to start a family? Is it even possible?
Excellent question. So I would say it's definitely possible. I think this is where childcare and really talking through with a partner, what does that look like, becomes very paramount, because this may be a situation where you have to look into au pairs, although they frequently have time constraints about how many hours they can work a week, but they typically live in-house with the family. I think it also is a question if you're doing it with a partner or without a partner. More and more women are choosing to have the single parent configuration on their own, and we have now reproductive technology that allows for that. And in that case, it's really making sure you have the support system in place for that. I think the other piece of it is that backup childcare piece, because if your significant other or spouse isn't able to get to daycare on time, do you need to hire in backup care in those moments where you're going to have to be traveling internationally? The other piece around that I would say is how to stay connected with children. And I think a lot of women carry a lot of guilt around traveling, but what we do know with kids and attachment is as long as there's consistency with both parents present, that kids still can have a really healthy attachment. So it's finding ways to remotely check in with your kids that I think can be really important, that work with them in their developmental age and stage, whether that's FaceTime or potentially texting or calling, ways that your partner can support you back home to helping the kids feel connected to you wherever you are in that moment.
How do the women let go of the guilt that is associated with choosing work over family, even if the husband or partner is completely on board?
So this goes back to what I help partners unpack a lot. And I think this is bigger than just your partnership, because I think it's kind of more of that cultural piece for us. It's how do we really set up the expectations that sometimes I think the biggest challenge is that a lot of times we, these mommy blogs that have popped up, which in some ways are great resources, I think can also reinforce this guilt, because there's this big kind of internet push-pull around stay-at-home moms versus working moms, which I think ends up just eroding both women's sense of security around being mothers versus recognizing that everybody's doing the best that they can. And I think if we can open up more space around stepping back from our own judgment of other moms and ourselves, it allows us to free up a little bit of space to let go of some of the guilt. There's no research showing that, I shouldn't say no research because I don't know off the top of my head. There's minimal research showing that working moms somehow create damage. In fact, most of the research that I've seen shows that for daughters, it actually raises daughters' self-esteem to have a working mom. And for sons, it actually creates a higher level of engagement, both in their own household growing up, but also in their households when they get older and they partner up. They tend to be a little more engaged in household responsibilities and chores. So kind of recognizing that some of putting yourself first helps send a really positive message to your kids. If you're prioritizing your career, it frees them up to also prioritize what they dream about and what they want to do.
I think what you've just said really speaks to the next person who wrote in, because she writes, I came from a traditional household where mom stayed at home and dad brought in the money. My husband and I both work and are a team when it comes to caring for our daughter. I often feel that my mom doesn't agree with my choice to be a working mom. What's the best way to deal with this? And I've never felt judged so much until I had my daughter.
Great question, because I actually came from the same situation. So my mom intentionally chose to be a stay-at-home parent. They intentionally chose to prioritize my dad's career over my mom working outside of the home. And I find my parents try to be supportive of my career and my sister-in-law's career, who's also a working mom. But I think we often get these indirect kind of jabs and barbs at us that I don't think my parents necessarily mean to give, but there is this underlying message that we're somehow hurting our kids, or this judgment that I experience from them. So a lot of times I try to step myself back and ask myself how much of this is my own guilt and how much of this is my own reconciling the difference of what I'm choosing to do as a mother versus what my mom chose to do as a mother. I think, again, I ground myself a lot in the research. I have a son, so I don't have the daughter piece, but recognizing that there is a lot of research showing that kids benefit from having working parents. And I would take it one step further as a clinician and sitting in the room both with individual women and couples is I think when moms are really invested in themselves and self-care and don't feel like their entire identity rests on taking care of the kids, that it actually frees up space for them to be better gardeners as parents, because our whole identity isn't fused up with how well our kids perform. So if our kids have minor failures or even major failures, it feels less like we as a person failed and more as a growing edge that they're going through. And again, I think it's really recognizing if it's coming from your mother and not quite as much about you and your own internal stuff, is there room to have a conversation with your mom too? So kind of taking that step back of, is she actually being judgmental, or are you perceiving it as judgment? If it's actually a dynamic happening with your parents, I would encourage you in a way that maybe would take some kind of sorting out, and I work with a lot of families around this. How can you actively bring up to your mom that you're experiencing how she's perceiving your parenting as judgment? And kind of checking in with her, because a lot of times I find that my own mother, even, her intention is actually to be helpful, and she doesn't recognize that how she's saying it is, for me, I'm experiencing it as judgment or criticism, if that makes sense. And it's a hard thing. We as Gen Xers and Millennials, we're the first set of women, like the baby boomers kind of paved the way for us and really got out there and created this ability for us to enter the workforce. But we're really kind of the first two generations that are trying to really actively engage in it in a way where they had to live out those old gender structures. So I think a lot of women that worked in the 80s felt highly judged, and especially in the 70s. And we have a little less judgment on the surface, but there's still this undercurrent of judgment underneath. And so we're kind of the tipping point generation that's kind of moving us into this next phase of how families are going to look. And that we're kind of like pioneers, and that kind of stinks. We don't have all the tools. We don't have a lot of resources. Not always easy to find mentors too.
Right. I think you bring up a good point, because the children seem to be happy with the moms working. They're proud of their moms. I know my mom, even though she's a lot older than everybody around us, worked, and I was so excited that my mom has a job. Exactly. So the idea that it's a bad thing or it hurts the kids is actually
not helpful. And I think, when you think back to the pragmatic era of marriage, moms were working just as much as dads. Like kids at that stage in history weren't really, they were kind of treated like little adults, like they had to work too. And so I think part of the child focused piece of our culture right now is recognizing that by going and taking care of ourselves, we're actually watering our children. And I think it's harder if you're in this carpentry phase of trying to parent. You end up accidentally thinking you have more power in how the outcome of the child is going to be than you actually do, if that makes sense. And I think another major piece of this is we're in a cultural place as women start out educating men, which is happening. I think the majority of people graduating from veterinary school now are women. We are going to have an economic shift that comes with it. And that's bumping into, I think, our political system right now. I think some of what's happening on the larger political stage is a reaction to this next surge of female economic power. It happened in the 20s, it happened in the 60s and 70s, and I think it's happening again now. If we continue to out-educate, we are going to start to out-earn.
Yeah, sure. And there was one thing that you mentioned earlier about if men earn a lot less or earn a lot more, that tends to make for an unhappy household. It can. It can.
Yeah, and female breadwinning households also report feeling less satisfied and less happy than even like equitable dual income households or households where the man earns more. And so I think that's a really important piece to be mindful of. I think when women start to push into more male-oriented positions in family, there's a reaction within the whole system, because it's not just men. I have a lot of my female clients who are breadwinners who start to report not being as sexually attracted to their husbands and finding him annoying, even though he's carrying this huge, responsibility at the household. If he's cooking dinner and picking up the kids and taking care of the kids, they're often, a lot of times, these women report wishing their husband was kind of more alpha male and more dominant in ways that I think it's both men and women. We have to open up space to look at each other in these less really strict, narrow avenues of what our gender could be.
Right. And perhaps we are expecting the marriage to be everything.
We are. And like Eli's book is fantastic in the sense that sometimes that really works for couples, but I would say in the majority of cases, I recently read a research study that showed that when couples actually go out for date night with other couples, their marital satisfaction goes up. And so there is something to socializing. We, as married couples, are socializing less and less than they did in the 70s. I think they spent something on average like 2 to 3 hours a week socializing, and now it's less than an hour. And most of our socialization nowadays tends to revolve around our kids. Like we go to like dinner parties with other couples who have kids the same age as ours, versus like leave the kids at home or put them in a different room or a different space and really focus on adult time. We've also become less and less connected to our extended family. And so I really encourage a lot of my clients to think through, it does take a village. So who do you want in your village with you? It doesn't have to be your family, but you need more than just your spouse, because that's too large of a burden.
What are some of the things you can do to set the stage for sharing responsibilities early in a marriage? How can we intentionally have those conversations and not slip into unconscious gender roles we were raised with?
That's a great question. And I a lot of it is, I encourage people to do premarital counseling. And a lot of the literature shows that helps, because you start talking through those things. Like, how do you want to financially structure the household? How do you want to structure cleaning responsibilities? And those might change over time as you economically have more ability to outsource. Early in a marriage, you may not be able to financially outsource your cleaning, but dividing up and being intentional, like I said earlier, around the tasks that you feel really strongly about maybe should be kept with you, but the tasks that you are comfortable with your spouse taking on, talk through them. If one of you makes dinner, does the other one do the cleanup? Like, set up some rules. And I think one of the really important pieces in this too is as your kids start entering into the picture, giving them chores. I view chores as life skills. And a lot of millennials in their early 20s and young adults have reported not having enough life skills. So there are all these like adulting classes popping up in New York. I think they're starting to show up here in Chicago. And so I often tell parents, like, you kill two birds with one stone. You teach your kid life skills and you free up some of the burden of you and your spouse. You also put that hierarchy back into place that mom and dad determine what gets done around the house and that the kids help do it. Because right now with parenting, a lot of times all we allow our children to do is homework, scheduled activities, including play dates, and whatever fun activity we've kind of structured for the family, versus allowing kids, even, as young as, I have my son already starting to learn how to clear his plate off the table at 3. It starts with making it just part of how life in a house operates that I think can be helpful with kids. And then talking through with your spouse, like, what chores did you have growing up? What chores did I have growing up? Where do you each feel you can best contribute to the household, I think becomes really important. And roles that you really see as too gendered, talk it through. I think for some, I love to cook, so I don't view that as a really overly gender loaded role. But for some people that would be. Cleaning the bathroom could be an overly gendered loaded role, taking out the trash. So really talking through the ways that make each of you feel best around it, I think is really important. And then having the conversation over and over again. It also sets the tone that you can talk about hard issues with each other, which I think is one of the greatest challenges I see once people start to get into these patterns of feeling disconnected. They talk less and less. And the more the topic becomes taboo to talk about, the harder it is to talk about it. So if you start early and often in your marriage talking about household management and household tasks, and that's where that logistics meeting comes into place. You have that grounding of every week on Sunday evening, we talk about the logistics of running our household. If you set that precedence early in your marriage, I think it opens up space that you talk about challenging things. You have touch points.
Sure. And that's a good point, because I think a lot of people, I'm not saying that people don't think about it before they get married, but
they don't.
Well,
a lot of people don't. They just, and that's one of the hard parts. So that happens with parenting too. We assume because we picked our perfect partner, who's our soulmate, who completes us, that we both have the exact same expectations for how we're going to parent. And if we don't actually have that conversation, you fall into really default roles that neither of you ever wanted to be in.
Yeah. Well, I know people who don't even talk about whether they're going to have children or not before they get married.
I know people that do that too. And then a lot of times they end up in my office because you can't, I joke with couples all the time. The only thing you can't compromise on is a kid. You can't have half a kid.
Right.
You can even compromise on locations. I've worked with couples that have lived in 2 different cities, but you can't compromise on a kid.
Right. That's a very good point. Okay. Well, I'm going to give people a chance to put in one last question if you want. Just a second. Chat. Is there any research you can share around women's career tracks when they have children?
So there's, and I guess without knowing specifically where in it. So some of the things that have come out are that we still are in a position where only about 30-ish% off the top of my head of couples who are in a dual income situation report equal priority on careers. We still tend to preferentiate, that's not a word. We still tend to put emphasis on men's career. I think it's like something, the 50s or 60% of dual income couples report the man's job being more important than the woman's. And I think it's fairly low. I want to say it's less than 15% of dual income households prioritize the female's job. So there's that piece of it. There's some really recent research coming out of Scandinavia that the wage inequality that still continues to remain across the globe, even in Scandinavia where they have a lot of stuff in place, they think is related to women stepping out of the workforce. Even with generous maternity benefits, they come back and your trajectory of being able to achieve, you're behind the 8 ball, you're behind the curve. Even in countries, I think Norway and Denmark both have mandatory paternity leaves as well as maternity leaves. Even in those situations, men's careers don't tend to lag quite as much as women's. And so there is still a cost ratio to giving birth, in essence. And I don't know if any of the research has actually looked at adoption and adoptive integration periods, but I would be inclined to think it's less impactful to a woman's career than the actual physical act of giving a birth and taking a maternity leave. And I'm not advocating for people not to do that, because that, I think there's something really important and valuable both for mother and child in that period of time. And I think the United States is really far behind on that kind of policy of family leave. But there is some evidence to show it is still impacting us. And I think there's also misperceptions around women's abilities to do it. I'm blessed enough to work at a company where 3 of our members of our C-suite are women. And we have a female CEO, but there is still very few women tracking into kind of managerial roles at that level of the C-suite level. I think there's some research to show it's a hindrance with certain types of medical careers. So it appears that a lot of women are steering themselves into education pools that are more conducive to being a both and. I'm a perfect example of that, somebody in the therapy world, veterinarians, where you maybe aren't on call to do surgeries on a Saturday night at 12 p.m. But I think overall, there is a lot of research showing that our current trying to tailor everything to a male-dominated world doesn't work, and that we really need to shift. And part of Anne-Marie Slattery's book is we need to think about it as the whole family, because this is hurting men too. And we really need to look at how we work and the way we design work to help both men and women shift in these gender roles so that women are freed up to have more room for their careers.
Sure. And we've got time for one last question. Do you have any statistics of what percentage of same-sex couples with children are dual income households as opposed to having one stay-at-home parent?
I don't. I do know that the research shows that same-sex couples tend to do it a little bit better. And a lot of this is, I think, one piece of it, and I work with a lot of same-sex couples, is because of a lot of the stigma that used to occur around same-sex couples having families and marrying. They're more intentional in their conversations about when they decide to become parents, because they have to be. They have to really think through how they want to be parents and when they want to be parents and how they want it to look. There does tend to be a split in same-sex couples where the lower income earner tends to take on more household management and the higher income earner is freed up to focus more on career. But it seems to be more of economic decisions versus you're presenting as more the quote unquote woman, so therefore you should stay home with the kids. It seems like they're basing it more on like who can bring more into the household and or whose career seems to be more important to them. So a lot of times I think the decision in same-sex couples is made around one person feels less engaged with their career versus one person feeling really like their career is really important to them. So the decision-making process seems all around, from what I've read, to be a little more intentional than heterosexual couples kind of allow themselves to slide into more of these gender normative roles.
Sure. Thank you, Emily, for all this great information. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we end the webinar?
No, I think we had some great questions.
We really
feel. Thank you so much for everyone taking the time too. This was really fun.
Thank you, Emily, for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us. To find all the archived and upcoming webinars, please check out the full webinar website through the NAA at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. Have a great rest of your day and go Cats!